I read a story the other day from one of the preachers from the Center of Excellence in Preaching, and he told a story about a professor, a Bible professor and commentator who was known for his outrageous demonstration of what could be seen as John's version of Pentecost. He would stand in front of the class and pull out a container of breath freshener, and then he would squirt a couple shots in his mouth and then walk around the class exhaling on each one of the students. He was reenacting Jesus breathing the Holy Spirit on or into the disciples. So since in this day and age, breathing on each other is not a good thing, we won't be breathing on each other, but we can imagine how Jesus breathed on them, said, "Peace be with you," and then he breathed on them the Holy Spirit, as it says in the Gospel of John, chapter 20. So as we've heard from the Gospel and Acts and in 1 Corinthians, that the Holy Spirit, I think, is power. It's divine power that, like Kay was saying, it came into the people all gathered to show that we can all be gathered as one, and that God gives us the Holy Spirit. So it's a divine power that comes to us. It gives us power to heal. It gives us the power to cast out evil spirits. It gives us the power to dream dreams and see visions. And these are fantastic and excellent gifts of the Spirit. But if we pause for a moment and think about it, when Jesus breathed that Spirit first on the disciples, he gave them the ability to forgive others. Forgiveness. He gave them the power of compassion. And since that was the first breath of the Spirit given to Jesus' followers, I think it might be the primary gift that's been breathed into all of us. The ability to have and to display and show compassion. Now, compassion is about justice and mercy, and that's at the heart of God's reign. Yet, when I think about the history of the church, compassion really isn't the first word that comes to mind. I think judgment and tolerance might be more appropriate words as we think back to things like the Crusades and the witch trials and all sorts of things like that. Now, as Kay said and as I said when we opened the service, we celebrate Pentecost as the birth of the church. So instead of looking at what the history tells us, maybe we should be thinking about what happened at Pentecost as the example of how the church should be. Imagine it. All those people who came from other places to be in Jerusalem, they were there for the festival of Shavuot, which is 50 days, it came 50 days after the Passover, which is close to our Easter, and it was a celebration of the first spring harvest. So here these people were, foreigners conversing in foreign tongues, and then a wind stirred among them, and in that moment they were amazed because everything that they heard they could understand. They found they could understand each other even in their own language. And I think that might have been a really fantastic opportunity to get to know the strangers in their midst. I wonder if anyone took some moments that day to talk to the person next to them, to find out who they were, where they came from. Could they establish any kind of common connection? And it could be that maybe something like that started to happen then. People started realizing that though they were foreigners, we were all foreigners to each other, they shared some things in common. And I think that it could be, because Peter stood up that day and attested to everyone, this is what's happening. God is giving us this gift. And after that day, people started following Christ. They started to embrace his way, God's way. But just like any new things, I know like when I come home from a retreat, or if you come back from a vacation, you've got this feeling of refreshment. But then after a while, the newness, the novelty starts to wear off. And I think that started to happen in those first days and those first years after Pentecost. The church grew in numbers, but then as they started to grow, they forgot the wonder and the compassion that the Spirit gave them for each other. And the sheer size of the numbers that started to grow, it meant the church kind of got bogged down. They got bogged down in the politics of orthodoxy, making sure everyone was learning the right thing. They started to grow suspicious of other religions, and they started to see it as competition instead of fostering the compassion that the original understanding the Spirit gave them brings. And it was happening so much so that Paul had to write to all the churches in the areas. He had his work cut out for him. Like in the epistle today, he had to remind the church in Corinth that God calls us beyond one another, beyond ourselves, beyond just caring for only ourselves, to caring for Christ's body. We may be all different, but we are one body, he says. So I like to imagine that for a brief time, some wonderful, just, and merciful acts took place. People who were strangers in a strange land weren't fearful of each other. And the residents weren't afraid of foreigners because they could talk to each other. They fleetingly had a common language that allowed them to see that they had much, much more in common, and that it was more than just understanding each other. It was compassion, a sharing with the other. Now, compassion, I've said it a few times, but it might make sense just to say, we can say we need to have compassion, but what does that mean? Compassion is knowing that someone else shares the same needs, the same hopes and dreams, the same fears as we do. It's knowing that another human being feels hunger and pain and loss and love just as we do. So I would venture to say then that compassion is the heart of our faith. It's what urges us to build houses alongside others who need safe, clean, and affordable shelter. Compassion is what urges us to provide food and supplies, especially now, for so many who cannot earn a living wage. Compassion makes us want to learn more about other places, other people, other religions, to find areas of common concern. And compassion allows us to put ourselves in someone else's shoes, welcoming the immigrant and the refugee, investing in the lives of a small village in Africa, such as we do, or sustaining orphanages and schools in Haiti, offering hospitality by sharing meals with our community, something that we've had to put on hold since we can't gather in large groups. Now, I don't know about you, but I didn't miss the irony of Jesus breathing the Holy Spirit on his followers, just as we are having to wear face masks to prevent us breathing on each other. And that has repercussions and implications for what worship in the next month or two may look like for us when we cautiously start to get back together. If and when we do, we're making some decisions in the next week. But despite this, or maybe because of this, I can imagine that could it be, as we do start to come together in smaller gatherings, that the Spirit we share will re-enliven some sense of the wonder that was there in the early church, a time when small groups grew close and encouraged each other to reach out to each other in compassion and others beyond their group. Could it be that we will appreciate so much more the power and the working of the Holy Spirit in our midst? And could it be we will recognize that God is doing something new and wonderful in our midst, even as we take the next steps, not knowing exactly how they will be, how they will lead us into the next days and weeks, but we do have the power of the Holy Spirit to encourage us, to keep us strong, and most of all, to keep us compassionate in our decisions, in our coming together, in all that we do. So could it be that God is doing a new thing among us? May it be so. Amen.